So when we're thinking about photography, we really need to think also about representation and representational thought. So ways of knowing that rely on the naming and defining of objects is also known as representational thought, a concept of the 17th century Enlightenment sciences which proposed the definability and mastery of natural worlds through categorization and a separation of the looker over the looked at. So representational ways of knowing are based on semiotic dichotomies. So the signifier, a name on an object, gives a certain value to what is being signified, the object, and in this case, the tree. So in this thought, knowers become reliant on the signifier, the name or representation of an object for truth. So with a stable image and definition of its value, it becomes static. We no longer require the object, the signified, to know. We can rely only on the signifier, the abstract representation of it. And this abstraction makes it much easier to generalize and classify. So representational knowledge has informed and continues to inform much Western thought, and though seemingly hidden, is visible in the structures which tend to guide early childhood education. So developmental psychology, ages and stages, licensing regulations, and curricular learning outcomes are some examples of this. These practices rely on representations and categorical thought to operate. And as we get deeper into thinking critically about this avenue of thought, I think something important to consider here is that in tracing or troubling representational thought doesn't mean denying its existence or abandoning it altogether. But in noticing commonsensical categories of thought which frame our practices, noticing seemingly hidden colonial grammars in this context of photography, we might think with care in how we use a camera and attune to what stories we choose to tell with a photo. Perhaps here we might be provoked to think things otherwise, to be curious about the illusion of stability in a photo, and consider possibilities for movement and other ways of knowing what it is that we're photographing. Might there be multiple ways of seeing than what is traditionally signified? So in Sylvia's article this week, she writes, our methods of photographing, representing, or crafting worlds propose particular possibilities of how the world might be. So in remembering Canada's settler colonial histories and noticing how these histories continue to play out in our daily practices, perhaps we might begin to unsettle some of the ways in which we assume things have always been done in research and pedagogy. In our, I can't say this word today, in our photography practices. So in taking up this lens, let's consider how we might pay attention in ways that highlight the banalities of everyday colonial violences and think about what kind of worlds we want to make possible through a photo. So this is not necessarily to create entirely anew, but to recognize the histories which shape an experience and create openings that allow for more complicated and contradictory ways of being here. And so thinking about how we might draw on some of the previous conversations in our weeks about the arts of noticing and the art of paying attention to help us to notice seemingly oppressive banalities and use the act of seeing as both a project of doing and thinking, to use a photograph to propose something, to gesture towards something worthy of critique and thought, and consider how I, as a teacher researcher, am answerable in this moment to others. So I'm going to read this quote from Sylvia Kind's article because I think especially the last sentence is quite impactful in this conversation. So she writes that visual methods such as photography often focus on the meanings and intentions of an image. For instance, who took the photo, what it was of, and why it was taken. This privileges the anthropocentric gaze and the semiotic purposes of photographs over dynamic, bodied, multi-sensuous enactments and the material practices of photography. Throughout the project, in seeking to understand what might lie outside the frames of typical practices, I was less concerned with the representational potential, the meanings or semiotic purposes of the images, and rather I was interested in the visual worlds they created and what we might learn about the doings and enactments of photography. So in your inquiries, how might you represent a concept in a way that responds to something, responds to the colonial natures at play in capturing a photo, your positionalities within these narratives, and how you might represent something in a way that doesn't seek to define, name, or make stable. Rather, how might you take a photo in a way that critically gestures toward a movement and an impermanence? So thinking about photography as a construction, as we spoke to last week, as a meeting place where it's not just about the representational quality of something, but how multiple components of a moment come together and provoke something. So thinking about a photograph not as a truth, but a particular view, a perspective, or a moment that has been constructed with multiple others. The photographer selects, chooses, edits, and constructs a view and a history. So who we are as teachers, researchers, and photographers, our orientations and positionalities matter in this construction. This is not a non-neutral positionality, and the work we produce comes from somewhere. Photographs are made. And lastly, the photograph is not the thing. The photograph is not the thing itself, but it's one component of a dynamic collection of actors who are moving together in a way to provoke something. So if we think about photography as a way of seeing, we're seeing from a particular point of view. And thinking of ourselves as photographers, we're inviting somebody to look in a particular way. There's a specific intentionality in the position and view we take in the photo, and we're trying to say something. We're trying to say something that might disrupt our usual perception, something that might call us to take a double look and look closer. In a way that makes us think about how and what we see and how we're entangled here. So thinking about these ways of seeing through photography, this week you're going to have 2 weeks to complete this portfolio entry 5 on gathering themes. So for this portfolio entry, you'll be engaging in photography and or video as a process of research. You'll have 2 weeks to complete this entry. In your virtual collaboratory, review the themes or emergent ideas that were generated from each of your initial photography exercises in Portfolio 4. Choose 1 or 2 of the themes that you feel are most generative and compelling and could lead you into an inquiry, something that deeply interests you. So when I'm talking about a theme can be an emergent idea, a generative seed, or a poetic phrase that gives shape to a particular notion. So generate some initial ideas and starting points with your group and spend the hour this week exploring, developing, and engaging this theme and notion, and consider how you might intensify this through photography and or video. And in light of the readings, consider how you might rethink representation in these images and or video. You can return to the same location or landscape or choose another location. So focus on actively investigating and constructing understandings of your theme. So this means that you should do more than passively observe what might already be out there, and try to fully engage in some way, immerse yourself in this research and research for understanding. So create a small online exhibition of your work, and this will be within your digital portfolio website. The exhibit should include a collection of images and text and give insight into some of the ideas within the theme and your processes of inquiry. So you should choose a title for your exhibit as well. So the exhibit may be a short edited video, a series of photographs, or a combination of both. You may arrange this exhibit as you like. Just make sure that your choices are intentional and speak to the understandings and insights that were generated from the experience. A few well-composed images can be just as powerful as several. So you can choose how many photos you'd like to display, but it should be enough so that the viewer can get a good sense of what you're trying to convey. So post a link to Portfolio 5 in the forum by October 12th at 11:55 p.m. and respond to 2 other entries by Sunday, October 14th. So you have 2 weeks to complete this exhibit, so it should be very rich and detailed and well thought out. So lastly, I've posted 2 links in the Moodle website to give you a sense of some ways of thinking with photography and of poetry. So Phyllis Schwartz writes, I use photography as an investigative tool. Some of this process eludes the eye and resultant image takes on a life of its own. As an artist, I'm a co-creator with the natural forces at work. The photography process shows me detail and texture. I move through the world slowly, freezing time and magnifying the moment. It brings me close to events, people, objects, phenomena, and ideas. In my work as a photographer, I seek detail, texture, and universals. And I'm a photographer poet on a journey in the quest of the poetic. It's an inquiry into the nature of permanence and impermanence. It asks what remains. So this is what's important, I think, to think about in photography is how we might pay attention to image and how we might use images and photography to speak to the essence of an experience. And I think that Phyllis Schwartz does this really beautifully in her photography, particularly of dancing. So be sure to check out that website. I've also included a link to a poetry and voice page that features the work of several Indigenous poets. And the link that I've included is specifically a poem by Billy Ray Belcourt, because I think that this is an impactful and provocative read, and perhaps inspiring as we begin to try out new modalities of poetic expression and begin to imagine ourselves as teachers and researchers. So that's about it for this week. Yeah, if you have any questions, email me again, and I'm looking forward to reading your proposals and taking a look at these Portfolio 5s. Have a great week, everyone.